Following the recent terror attacks in Paris, French President Francois Hollande has been building an international effort to ramp up the fight against ISIL. Tuesday, he was here in Washington, D.C. for a meeting with U.S. President Barack Obama at the White House. Obama showed strong solidarity for Hollande's efforts.
In short, this was not only a strike against one of the world's great cities. It was an attack against the world itself. It's the same madness that has slaughtered the innocent from Nigeria to the Sinai, from Lebanon to Iraq. It is a scourge that threatens all of us.
President Hollande said he and Obama have agreed to intensify their nation's assault on ISIL.
We have decided, President Obama and myself, to intensify our strikes in Syria and Iraq, to increase their range, to strengthen our sharing of information on targets that we should aim for. Our priority is taking back key locations occupied by Daesh in Syria and Iraq.
Meanwhile, a Russian military aircraft was shot down by Turkey near the Turkish-Syrian border, and Russian President Vladimir Putin has strongly condemned the action. We'll get a Russian perspective later on in the show, but we begin here with our panel in the studio. Joining me now is Philip Crowther. He is White House Correspondent for France 24. Also with us is Simon Marks. He is President and Chief Correspondent for Feature Story News. And joining us too is Tony Shaffer. He is a retired US Lieutenant Colonel and is a Senior Fellow with the London Centre for Policy Research. Welcome all. I have to start with you, of course, Philip. You're the Frenchman in the room. Hollande came here to build a grand coalition against ISIL following those devastating attacks in Paris 10 days ago. But then we saw the downing of this Russian jet over Syria. Can one happen while what's going to happen in Syria?
Well, I think it certainly gave US President Obama a chance to use that downing of the jet as a description for him of what is not going right in terms of the Russian tactics. He says that if the Russians are downing this jet in that area, it shows that they're not attacking the Islamic State organization. And that's, of course, precisely what French President Hollande is looking for, is for Russia to change its tactics, to come on board in that fight against the Islamic State group, which, of course, according to the Americans, they're not doing at this point. He wanted that great coalition, as he says, and that might be a term that he regrets by now, because he got none of that, did he, during this meeting with President Obama?
Tony Shaffer, yes. I mean, President Obama, while praising his friend President Hollande, seemed to basically be defending U.S. strategy so far in the fight against ISIS, basically saying that they're contained.
Well, defending a failed strategy, that's the whole point of this. Yeah, and President Obama mentioned the 65-member coalition, which I'd still like to know all the memberships and what exactly they're doing. Let me be blunt here. Look, I've talked to folks at the Pentagon, I've talked to folks down south at Central Command. The strategy has not worked, and I think this is where I think President Obama continues to derail his own effort. And simply put, if talking how we're going to really stick it to the terrorists by having a climate change conference in 2 weeks did not put the fear in anyone, let alone ISIS. So I think we've got to fix the strategy. I know General Joe Dunford just took over as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He is doing a bottom-up review of the strategy right now. I'd like to believe once he does that, and plus obviously there's been cooking of the intelligence books in the American media that's been discussed, I think there's some real changes that have to be looked at regarding what the U.S. is doing, how we're doing it, and how it's going to be effective.
Simon, the downing of this jet, does it actually make people wake up and smell the coffee and say, we kind of have to cooperate because the stakes are getting so high in the skies above Syria?
Well, you know, Barack Obama and Francois Hollande would love it to do that. I mean, if they agreed on anything today, it was that they really want to try and persuade Vladimir Putin to change course in Syria. But look at what happened with the downing of the jet. We talk about the downing of the jet, but there were basically 3 incidents. The downing of the jet, the first time in 50 years that a Russian fighter has been downed by a member of NATO. Then the killing of the 2 pilots as they parachuted to what they thought was safety by Turkmen rebels, loosely allied with the United States, and then an attack on a Russian rescue helicopter. If you're Vladimir Putin sitting in the Kremlin with the opportunity to say, look, I've been telling you that the Americans are allied with these awful ragtag group of people in Syria, this demonstrates it, why on earth would he now step back from embracing his ability to try and advance that argument?
Philip, Hollande goes from Washington to Moscow. Is there any hope of pulling Moscow and Washington together over this?
Well, Washington was supposed to be the first step in this, and the White House was supposed to give Hollande basically a message to take with him to Moscow. And that message is pretty clear now from what we saw in the East Room of the White House earlier today. That was that the United States does not believe in Russia being on board in this grand coalition, this joint military strategy. Essentially what President Obama said today was there are two existing coalitions. Forget about this great coalition of yours, he said to indirectly to Mr. Hollande. He said, look, I've got a coalition, that is the 65-nation coalition that exists at this point, and there's that other one of two countries, Russia and Iran, he said.
But no boots on the ground, as people say.
Well, not on behalf of the French. There was a promise
Hollande
today.
won't, but the US won't.
No.
And can you win by airstrikes, Tony?
Oh, absolutely not. This is insane. This is one of the reasons I think we've seen ISIS take over so much territory. Ungoverned space is the key here. We saw in Libya once Muammar Gaddafi was deposed, chaos ensued. That's what we have to prevent in Syria. That's why I understand what Vladimir Putin is trying to do.
And the Russians would argue in Iraq, in Cote d'Ivoire, wherever there's been an intervention,
exactly.
This happens.
And so that's why I think in limited terms what Russia is doing is good. They need to stabilize Syria. With that said, though, Putin's in it for Putin. Putin's long-term strategy is to gain control of 60% of the world oil. We see it coming.
Well,
and the idea here is it's not simply just two countries. It's actually Syria, Iran, and Russia. We're calling it the Damascus Pact, and frankly, a big chunk of Iraq will probably go with it as well. So this is no small issue.
Well, Simon, pick up on that. Because is the way to defeat ISIL through actually getting some sort of movement to peace or cohabitation on the ground in Syria?
Well, they both said that at the White House today, didn't they? Even, it's just worth noting, and you heard it in the clip at the beginning of the program, Francois Hollande was the one who announced the intensification of the military campaign against ISIL, not Barack Obama. Barack Obama couched things in terms of, we want to do more, but it's going to require other nations to ramp up and respond.
And who do you mean by other nations? French?
He's
or
clearly
the
pointing
region?
at the Europeans. He's clearly pointing at the Europeans and saying that they need to be doing more. He also, it's worth pointing out, called on the European Union to ratify intelligence sharing and flight information, flight manifest lists, challenging the European Union to ratify an agreement that's previously been struck. So he's basically saying, it's up to others now to come in and help us achieve this. And again, if you're Vladimir Putin sitting in the Kremlin watching this and seeing, frankly, some division on display between Barack Obama and Francois Hollande, you're thinking that your strategy is looking pretty good at the moment.
And the White House is also showing at this point the weaknesses of this coalition effort when you hear the White House over the last few days insisting again and again that yes, there's been an intensification from the French. In other words, 20 or so airstrikes on the first day after the attacks in Paris, very little after that. But the White House has been very clear, none of that would have been possible without American help. And that is American help that concerns pretty much everything other than the actual airstrikes. The targeting is American, the intelligence is American, even the search and rescue effort, if it had been needed, says the White House, would have been done on behalf of the Americans. If a French pilot had been shot down over Syria, the Americans would have gone in.
Simon, you've covered Washington for a long time. Francois Hollande's rhetoric has been compared to George W. Bush after the 9/11 attacks. The war on terror launched again from Paris. Is Paris going to do the same thing?
Look, I think to be fair to Francois Hollande, he came to Washington with an enormous degree of moral authority behind his back. I mean, what took place in Paris last week was absolutely comparable in geopolitical terms to the attacks on the United States of September 11th, 2001. And I think it is perfectly understandable that he's trying to position himself as the central figure to bring about a more coordinated international response to it. The problem is you've got these other figures, Barack Obama on the one hand, Vladimir Putin on the other, whose calculations are not entirely based around the magnitude and the gravity of the events that took place in Paris. It's natural that that's what's driving Francois Hollande. The French electorate is driving that too. But these other guys and these other players in all of this have got different calculations that they're making.
Tony, so you think that the chance of a global alliance to defeat ISIL, not just from the air, but also with regional allies, is a bit of a pipe dream in the moment?
Well, we have to. One of the concepts we
But it's not happening.
Well, we put forward a concept almost 2 years ago now of an Arab NATO, if you will. I've talked personally to President al-Sisi about this. The Arabs are willing to do something more, to actually go into the part of Iraq that Sunni on Sunni, trying to basically settle at peace. And then the Kurds. I've had direct contact with all the Kurds. We've brought the Kurds in to meet with Senator McCain. The question now becomes, can we put the pieces together to be effective for our interests, Western interests? The Russians have already said they're in it to win it for their guy. There's no doubt now. Today made it very clear. And while President Hollande is trying to say, and he did actually say this, we should avoid escalation of doing things against the Russians, Barack Obama said within the next 30 seconds, Putin deserved what he got. So it's very clear the messaging on our side is broken, and I agree. This is an opportunity for President Putin to move on down the road with his game plan.
Well, what about Turkey here? Because Turkey is a member of NATO, part of this coalition. But you noticed from NATO's comments today, Philip, that they were really saying, hey, Turkey, don't rush to judgment. It almost seemed as if they were saying, you know, really shouldn't have shot down this plane. You could have escorted it out of airspace. What do you think?
And I think that's pretty much what the administration is saying today as well. From what I've been seeing, yeah, absolutely. From what I've been seeing recently, do we have clear maps yet of where this plane actually went? It might have gone over a sliver of land, possibly during just.
Well, the Russians put out their version, obviously,
and the Turks were very quick in doing theirs too. So you know, where are we going to go?
Well, so the Pentagon said that the coalition forces had heard the Turkish pilots warning the Russians, but did not hear any response from the Russians. And if you look at what was said today at the State Department, what was said at the Pentagon, and what Turkey went through at NATO, where they were reportedly asked why they took such precipitate action, there's clearly some question about precisely what led up to the shooting down of that plane.
And we know Turkey's been only so far with anybody on this. Clearly, they've been wishing to get rid of President Assad, period. Well, and I think this was, and then they've left the borders open for ISIS to come and go regarding replenishment, black market, all these other things. So Turkey has its own agenda as well. So this is even more complex by the fact that one of our close allies is actually playing its own game.
Philip, final word. Will President Hollande get what he wants? Will the war against ISIL actually tick up?
I think it will ever so slightly. There might be a few more airstrikes, certainly from the French. They want to make some symbolic airstrikes more than anything else. They'll get a little bit more from the Americans. But I think that's pretty much it, because if you look at this grand tour that Francois Hollande has organized, he's seeing Angela Merkel of Germany tomorrow, then he obviously moves on to Moscow. The first step simply has not worked out. He didn't get what he wanted, and the message that he takes to Moscow is basically a negative one. If you stay in your little coalition of 2 or 3, then we're not going to work together. That's the message from the White House. And you saw, if you make the 9/11 comparison, this is a president who's on a war footing, self-declared war footing, who was cut down very, very quickly by the most powerful man in the world in the East Room of the White House and was told, your plan won't work.